The afternoon sun pushed through the high, rectangular windows of the concert hall, cutting bright lines across the dusty floor. It was a big day, the kind of day that made young musicians nervous and their parents even more nervous. The air inside felt thick, smelling of floor wax and old velvet seats. This was the final round of the regional auditions. Usually, the room was filled with the sounds of perfect scales, fast fingers, and expensive instruments. Today, however, there was a strange buzzing noise coming from the back of the stage. The judges sat behind a long table covered in black cloth. There were 3 of them, but the one in the middle was the one everyone watched. He was a man who seemed to have been born wearing a tuxedo. His name was Mr. Sterling, and to the people waiting in the wings, he looked like a king sitting on a throne. He had silver hair that was combed perfectly to the side and glasses that sat low on his nose. He was known for being harsh. If you played one wrong note, he would sigh loudly. If you looked messy, he would write on his paper until his pen tore through it. So far, the auditions had gone exactly as expected. A young girl with a shiny violin had played perfectly. A tall boy with a cello had played loudly. Everyone was polished, everyone looked expensive. Then, the schedule listed a name that didn't fit the pattern, an old man named Thomas. Thomas was not what anyone expected. He walked onto the stage not with the confident stride of a young prodigy, but with the slow, careful steps of someone who knew his joints might ache if he moved too fast. He was wearing a suit that had likely been bought 20 years ago. The color was a dark blue that had faded to a sort of dull gray, and the cuffs were slightly frayed. His shoes were polished, but they were old, thick leather things that had walked many miles. But it wasn't Thomas that made the room go quiet. It was what he was pushing. He was struggling with a heavy dolly. On it sat an upright piano, but it wasn't a beautiful instrument. It was, to be honest, a wreck. The wood was a dark brown color, but in places the varnish had peeled away, showing the lighter wood underneath like a scar. One of the corners was chipped. The keys were slightly yellowed, looking like old teeth rather than white ivory. Perhaps the worst part was the right pedal. It was held together with a strip of silver duct tape that was starting to curl at the edges. The contrast was almost funny. The stage was fancy, the lights were bright, and the judges looked expensive. And here was this old man in a faded suit pushing a broken piano that looked like it had been rescued from a trash heap. Thomas reached the center of the spotlight. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief he took from his pocket. His hands were rough and large, the hands of a man who had worked with tools or heavy machinery his whole life, not delicate piano keys. He patted the top of the piano gently, the way a father might pat a child's shoulder, and began to unlock the keyboard cover. Behind the table, Mr. Sterling shifted in his chair. The leather squeaked. He looked at the piano, then at his paperwork, then back at the piano. He leaned over to the woman sitting next to him and whispered something, pointing his pen at the stage. The woman shook her head, looking confused. Thomas opened the lid. He didn't look out at the audience. He didn't look at the judges. He just focused on the task. He checked the bench height. He lowered it slightly. It creaked, a loud, unhappy groan that echoed through the speakers. The silence in the room was changing. It wasn't a respectful silence anymore. It was the silence people make when they are trying to not laugh. In the wings, a few teenagers covered their mouths with their hands. Someone snorted. Mr. Sterling didn't try to hide his amusement. He leaned forward, tapping the microphone in front of him. The sound made a loud thump that made Thomas jump slightly. The old man turned and looked at the table, his eyes calm and a bit confused. "I'm sorry," Sterling said, his voice booming through the hall. He didn't sound sorry at all. He sounded like a teacher who had caught a student eating glue in class. "Is there a problem with the moving crew? Why is that thing on the stage?" Thomas blinked. He put a hand on the dusty top of the piano. "This is my instrument, sir. I brought it myself." Sterling let out a sharp, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of disbelief. He looked around the room as if asking everyone else if they were seeing the same joke. "You brought it? Mr. Thomas, is it?
We have a 9-foot concert grand sitting in the corner, covered by a blanket. It is worth more than this entire building probably cost when it was built. And you choose to wheel in that?" He gestured vaguely at the battered upright. The audience stirred. It was awkward. They felt bad for the old man, but they also understood the director's point. The piano looked like it belonged in a junkyard, not a concert hall. Thomas didn't get angry. His face didn't turn red. He just looked at the keys with a look of such intense love that it made the laughter in the room die down a little bit. He rubbed his thumb over a chipped key. "She's old, sir," Thomas said, his voice soft but steady. "I know she doesn't look like much, but she has a good voice." Mr. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He picked up his pen again, twirling it between his fingers. "A good voice? It looks like it hasn't been tuned since the last century. Look at that pedal. Is that tape?" "Yes, that is tape," Thomas admitted simply. "The metal broke a long time ago. The tape holds it just fine, though. You just have to be gentle with her." "Gentle?" Mr. Sterling repeated, rolling his eyes. The other two judges sat very still, looking down at their papers, not wanting to be part of the mocking, but afraid to stop it. "This is a competition for excellence, for mastery. We're looking for the best of the best, and you roll up in a suit that doesn't fit and a piano held together with sticky tape." He shook his head. "It's insulting to the other students, honestly. Do you really think you can compete with a toy like that?"
The word toy hung in the air. It was a cruel word for an instrument that clearly meant the world to the man standing next to it. Thomas finally looked up. He looked directly at Mr. Sterling. His eyes were watery, pale blue, and filled with a sadness that went deep, deep down. He didn't seem to hear the insult. He just seemed tired. "It's not a toy," Thomas said quietly. "It's all I have. But if you listen, maybe you will hear something good." Sterling snorted. He checked his watch. "Fine, let's get this over with. We have a schedule to keep. But let me be clear, Thomas, we are not interested in sob stories. We are interested in talent. And if that thing sounds as bad as it looks, I will cut you off in 10 seconds. He waved his hand dismissively, like he was shooing away a fly. "Go on then, play your song." The room went quiet again. The air conditioning hummed louder. The few people who were giggling stopped, realizing that the situation had shifted from funny to just uncomfortable. Thomas turned his back to the judges. He sat down on the bench. It creaked again under his weight. He reached out his rough worker's hands and hovered them over the yellowed keys. For a second, he just sat there. He closed his eyes. He took a breath that filled his chest and made his shoulders rise. He wasn't thinking about the man in the tuxedo. He wasn't thinking about the torn velvet seats or the bright lights. He was somewhere else. He was in a small, warm living room a long time ago. He could smell roast beef cooking. He could hear a woman humming along to the radio. Mr. Sterling tapped his pen on the table, impatient. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas lowered his hands. The moment his fingers touched the plastic keys, the entire feeling of the room changed. He didn't play a loud chord to start. He played a single soft note. It was a little wobbly, yes. It had a buzz to it, but it was clear. And it was the start of something that nobody in that hall would ever forget. The old man sat on the bench, which let out another groan, like an old dog settling down for a nap. He stared at the keys in front of him. Up close, you could see just how much work this piano had done during its life. The white keys were no longer white. They were a pale, creamy color, stained by years and thousands of touches. Some of the black keys were shiny where his fingers had landed on them over and over again, while others were dull and matte. Mr. Sterling was still holding his pen, hovering it over the score sheet. He looked at his watch, then back at the stage. He let out a loud, bored sigh that echoed through the microphone. It was a rude sound, meant to rush the old man along. But Thomas didn't move. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed.
For a moment, the only sound in the huge hall was the low hum of the air conditioning system. It was a boring electric sound that made the silence feel even heavier. The young students in the shadows started to shuffle their feet. They were checking their phones or whispering to each other. They didn't see the point in this. To them, this was just a break before the next real musician came out. But Thomas wasn't wasting time. He was traveling. In his mind, the fancy concert hall with the high windows was gone. He wasn't on a stage with bright lights in his eyes. He was back in a tiny, drafty apartment. It was a place so small that you could touch the walls if you stretched out your arms. He remembered the smell of that apartment, cabbage soup cooking on the stove, and the faint scent of lavender soap. He remembered the day they bought the piano. It had been a sunny Saturday, just like today. He and his wife had seen it in the window of a second-hand shop. It wasn't new then either, but they had saved every penny for months. He remembered how she laughed, a bright ringing sound as they tried to push it up the narrow stairs to their floor. They were young then, strong and full of hope. They didn't have much money, but they had this music. Thomas opened his eyes just a little bit. He looked down at his hands. They were big hands, rough from decades of working in a warehouse. The skin was thick, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. Some people might say these hands were made for lifting boxes, not for touching delicate keys, but he knew better. These hands had held babies. These hands had held his wife's hand when she was sick. These hands had learned to speak when words failed him. He placed his left hand on the low notes. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly under the faded suit jacket. He wasn't thinking about the scholarship money. He didn't care about the trophy or the applause. He was just thinking about the melody. It was a tune that used to play on the old radio in the kitchen when they first got married. Mr. Sterling tapped his pen on the table again. Tap, tap, tap. It was an annoying, rhythmic sound. "We are waiting," the director mumbled, though he didn't speak into the microphone this time. Thomas ignored him. He let his fingers press down. The first sound that came out wasn't a perfect, clear bell tone like the ones from the expensive grand piano in the corner. It was a softer, rounder sound. It had a slight woody quality to it, like a cello. And there was a tiny buzz, a faint rattle that happened when the note hit the bottom of its range. It was an imperfection. It was a flaw. The old man shook his head immediately. He made a mark on his paper, probably a big red X. He leaned back and crossed his arms, a look of "I told you so" on his face. But Thomas didn't stop. He played the next note and then the next. He was playing a piece of music by a composer named Chopin. It was a nocturne, a song meant for the night. It started slow and sad. The notes didn't rush. They walked slowly, one by one, stepping into the room. As the melody grew, something strange began to happen. The buzz in the piano didn't sound like a mistake anymore. It sounded like a voice. It sounded like an old person telling a story, slightly raspy but full of wisdom. The music floated up from the battered soundboard and drifted into the high ceiling of the hall. The students in the back row stopped looking at their phones. One by one, their heads lifted up. The whispering stopped completely. The music wasn't loud, but it was strong. It pulled at them. It wasn't showing off how fast the fingers could move. It was showing them a feeling.
Thomas's right hand began to move a little faster, playing a gentle ripple of notes high up, while his left hand kept the slow, steady beat down low. It sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, but gentle rain, the kind that makes you want to sleep. The contrast between the rough, battered look of the piano and the beautiful, gentle sound coming out of it was confusing to the brain. It didn't make sense. How could something so broken make something so lovely? Mr. Sterling stopped tapping his pen. He held it in midair, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. He was a man who knew music technically. He knew all the rules. He knew that this piano was out of tune. He knew that the old man's tempo was a bit shaky, slowing down here and speeding up just a tiny bit there. But he also knew that he couldn't look away. There was a rawness to the playing that you couldn't learn in a school. Sterling heard young prodigies every day. They played perfectly. Every note was in the right place, every dynamic marked exactly as the composer wrote it. But it often felt cold. It felt like a math problem. This was different. This was messy. This was human. Thomas's face relaxed as he played. The worry lines on his forehead smoothed out. He wasn't seeing the judges anymore. He was seeing his wife, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, sewing a button on a shirt. She would look up and smile when he played this song. She would tell him that he played it beautifully, even when he messed up. He played a section where the music got higher, more intense. His fingers, despite their age and stiffness, found the right keys. It wasn't easy for him. You could see the effort in his arms, the way his shoulder muscles tensed under the cheap fabric of his suit. He was fighting against the instrument, and the instrument was fighting back. But together, they were making something new. The air in the hall felt different now. It wasn't just a room full of people waiting for the next thing. It was a room full of people listening to a memory. The duct tape on the pedal didn't matter. The chipped varnish didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the sound that was filling the space, wrapping around the velvet seats and the stone walls. Mr. Sterling leaned forward slowly. The cynical look on his face was cracking, crumbling away like dry dirt. He looked at the old man's hands again. He saw the wedding ring on the third finger of his left hand flashing in the spotlight. He saw the way Thomas touched the keys, not with force, but with a kind of desperate tenderness, as if he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The music swelled, getting louder, fuller. The old piano seemed to wake up. The strings inside the wooden body vibrated with a rich, deep tone that surprised everyone. It had a character that the shiny, perfect grand pianos didn't have. It had soul. Sterling felt a strange tightness in his throat. He swallowed hard, trying to clear it. He looked down at his evaluation paper. He had written "poor instrument" at the top. Now he looked at those words and felt foolish. He reached out with his pen, but he didn't write anything. He just tapped the paper gently, lost in the sound. Thomas didn't know he was winning them over. He was just playing. He was playing for the woman who wasn't there. He was playing for the life they had built. And as the melody flowed from his heart, through his rough hands, and into the old wood of the piano, the judgment in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, undeniable respect. The music didn't just stay in one place. It began to move through the air like a living thing. As Thomas reached the middle part of the song, the notes started to climb higher, like a person walking up a staircase toward a light. The tempo picked up just a little bit. It wasn't fast like a race car, but it had a purpose now. It was pulling everyone forward. Mr. Sterling found himself leaning so far over the table that he was almost falling out of his chair. He had his elbows on the black cloth, his chin resting on his knuckles. He wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He wasn't thinking about his lunch or the next contestant. His eyes were fixed on the old man's hands. It was strange to watch. Thomas's fingers were thick and the joints were swollen. Usually, fingers like that are good for gripping a hammer or steering a wheel. They looked too clumsy to dance across black and white keys. But they were dancing. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his age. When he had to play a fast run of notes, a flurry of sound that rushed down the keyboard like water, his pinky finger would stick out a little bit, curving away from the rest of his hand. It was an odd habit, a quirk of his self-taught style. In a normal audition, Sterling would have marked that down as a technical error. Bad form, he would have muttered. But today, watching that little finger fly in the air while the other fingers did the work, it didn't look like an error. It looked like a bird taking flight. It looked like pure emotion overflowing out of his body because his hands couldn't hold it all in.
The battered piano was doing things it had no right to do. When Thomas hit the lower notes, the deep, heavy sounds, you could feel the vibration in the floor. The duct tape on the pedal shook, but it held. The sound was gritty. It wasn't the clean, smooth sound of a digital recording. It had texture. It had a scratchiness to it, like sand rubbing on stone, but underneath that scratch was a warmth that wrapped around the room. The teenagers in the back row were completely still now. The tall boy with the cello had put down his phone. The girl with the shiny violin had stopped polishing her instrument. They were staring at the stage with their mouths slightly open. They realized that they weren't hearing a performance. They were hearing a story. And the story was getting intense. Thomas's face changed. His eyes were squeezed tight, and his eyebrows were pulled together in a look of deep concentration, maybe even a little pain. He wasn't just pressing keys, he was fighting them. He was wrestling every single note out of the old wood. You could see the muscles in his arm forms under the cheap fabric of his suit. He was fighting against the instrument, and the instrument was fighting back, but together they were making something new.
The music grew louder. It swelled up like a wave getting ready to crash. The melody was beautiful, but it was sad too. It sounded like someone saying goodbye. It sounded like the feeling you get when you look at old photographs and wish you could go back to that day, even for just a minute. Mr. Sterling felt a lump form in his throat. He tried to push it down, but it wouldn't move. He looked at the other judges. The woman on the right had taken off her glasses and was wiping her eyes with a tissue. The man on the left was staring at his shoes, his foot tapping very gently along with the beat. None of them had ever experienced anything like this in this hall. Usually the music was just sound, impressive, skilled sound, but it didn't touch you. This music was grabbing them by the collar and shaking them. Thomas played a series of chords that were meant to be struck with force. Boom, boom, boom. The piano shook. A piece of loose veneer on the side of the instrument actually vibrated with a buzz. Sterling waited for the cringe. He waited for the moment where the bad sound ruined the piece. But it didn't. The buzz just added to the honesty of it. It was like a crack in a voice when someone is crying. It made it real. The old man's breathing was getting heavier. You could see his chest rising and falling rapidly from where the audience sat. He was getting tired. Playing the piano is physical work, especially when you were putting your whole soul into it. But he didn't slow down. He kept pushing, driving the music forward, as if he was afraid that if he stopped, the magic would disappear and he would be just an old man on a stage again. He transitioned into a part of the song that was complicated. His right hand had to jump around, hitting notes high and low, while his left hand kept a steady rhythm. It was the kind of passage that young students practiced for months to get smooth. Thomas didn't play it smoothly, he played it roughly. He hit some keys harder than others. He missed a very quick connection between two notes, creating a tiny stumble. Sterling winced slightly. It was a mistake. But then, before he could feel disappointed, Thomas recovered. He didn't stop. He didn't look down in shame. He just kept going, and the way he played the next phrase was so full of feeling that it made the mistake seem unimportant. It made the mistake seem human. It was perfect because it wasn't perfect. The sound filled the entire hall now. It bounced off the high ceiling and the plaster walls. It seemed to soak into the velvet curtains. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment the whole room felt golden. Thomas was sweating now. A drop of perspiration rolled down his temple and got lost in his gray sideburns. He was lost in the music too. He wasn't in the audition hall. He was back in that small living room. He was playing for her. He could almost see her sitting there, her hands folded in her lap, listening. He was playing all the love he ever felt, all the regret he ever had, and all the hope he still carried. The music began to rise to a high point. The notes were getting higher and faster, climbing toward a peak.
The tension in the room was tight like a rubber band stretched to its limit. Everyone was holding their breath, the students, the judges, the custodian standing in the back door. Everyone was waiting to see where the old man would take them. Mr. Sterling realized he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He had spent his life teaching students that technique was the most important thing. He taught them that posture and finger strength and the right instrument were what made music great. He looked at the duct tape on the pedal. He looked at the frayed cuffs of the old man's suit. He realized he had been wrong, completely wrong. The music wasn't coming from the piano. It wasn't even coming from the old man's hands. It was coming from somewhere deep inside, a place that no amount of money could buy and no school could teach. The battered piano was just a tool. The hands were just the messengers. The real music was the man's life, pouring out into the open for everyone to see. Thomas hit a long, high note that rang out clear and bright, cutting through the heavy air like a knife. He held it, his hand trembling with the effort, his face turned up toward the lights as if he was looking at heaven. The sound vibrated, hanging there, suspended in time. It was the most beautiful, break-hearting sound any of them had ever heard. And then, just as the note began to fade, he brought his hands down for the final crashing chords that would end the piece, ready to give the last of his strength to the silence that would follow. Thomas's hands came down on the final chords. It wasn't a soft ending. It was a heavy, resonant crash that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. The old wood of the piano groaned under the pressure, vibrating violently against the floor. The sound was huge, filling every corner of the massive hall, echoing off the high ceiling and bouncing back down to the audience like a physical weight. Then Thomas lifted his hands. He didn't pull them away quickly. He lifted them slowly, his fingers curling inward as if he was trying to hold on to the sound for just a second longer. He kept his foot pressed down on the taped pedal, letting the notes blend together into a murky, beautiful haze that slowly, slowly faded into nothing. The very last whisper of sound drifted away and was swallowed by the silence. It wasn't the usual kind of silence that follows a performance. Usually, after a student plays, there is a split second of quiet before the polite clapping starts. People are clearing their throats, shuffling their programs, getting ready to applaud. But this was different. This silence was heavy. It was thick. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire audience had been turned to stone. Mr. Sterling sat frozen, his hand still hovering over his evaluation paper, his pen trapped in his grip. He stared at the stage, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The smirk, the arrogance, the boredom, all of it was gone. In its place was a look of utter shock. His mouth was open just a fraction of an inch, but he couldn't find the words to close it or speak.
He looked at the battered piano. He looked at the duct tape. He looked at the chipped varnish. None of it made sense to him anymore. How could something so broken produce something so whole? How could an old man with no formal training reach inside his chest and pull out a sound that the best students in the country couldn't touch? Sterling felt a strange pressure behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, looking down at his paper. He had written technique poor and tone unacceptable. Now those words looked like they were written in a foreign language. They felt stupid. They felt insulting. He realized with a sudden hot pang of shame that he had judged a book by its cover, and he had missed the most beautiful story inside. On the stage, Thomas let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a man deflating, letting go of all the tension he had been holding. His shoulders dropped. He looked incredibly small sitting there on the bench in that big empty spotlight. He rubbed his thumbs over his fingertips, perhaps feeling the ghost of the vibration, perhaps just missing the feeling of the music.
He slowly turned his head to look at the judges' table. He didn't look for applause. He didn't look for a score. He looked at them with a kind, tired expression, as if to say, "I hope you liked it. I did my best." The silence stretched on. It was becoming uncomfortable now. It was lasting too long. Thomas's smile faltered just a little. He started to lift his hands to close the keyboard lid, thinking that his time was up. He assumed that the lack of noise meant they had hated it. He thought Mr. Sterling was writing a rejection letter right that second. But then, a sound broke the quiet. It came from the back of the hall. A young man, a guitar player who had been waiting in the wings for his turn, stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up. Then the girl with the shiny violin stood up next to him. Then the parents in the front row began to rise. It started like a ripple in a pond, but it grew quickly. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. The silence was shattered by the sound of fabric rustling and shoes scuffing the floor as 300 people stood up at the same time. And then the applause started. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the rhythmic clap, clap, clap that people do when they're just being nice. This was a roar. It was a wall of noise that hit the stage like a physical wave. People were cheering. They were whistling. The tall boy with the cello was shouting "Bravo" at the top of his lungs. A woman in the third row was crying openly, clapping her hands so hard they must have stung. Thomas looked out at the sea of people. His eyes went wide. He clearly wasn't expecting this. He put a hand to his heart, a look of genuine surprise washing over his face. He gave a small, shy wave, like a child who had just been caught doing something good. Mr. Sterling stood up slowly. He was the last one to rise. He felt heavy, like gravity was pulling on him harder than usual. He looked at the other judges. The woman to his right was wiping her eyes again, smiling through her tears. The man to his left was clapping slowly, looking at Sterling with a knowing glance, as if to say, "Well, you were wrong." Sterling walked to the edge of the stage. The applause was deafening now, echoing off the walls. He signaled for the microphone. The sound engineer, who had been leaning forward with his mouth open, fumbled for a button and cut the speakers, so Sterling's voice wouldn't boom, but would just carry across the sudden dip in the noise. The crowd quieted down slightly, sensing that the director wanted to speak. They kept clapping, but softer now, a rhythmic background of support. Sterling stood at the edge of the platform. He looked up at Thomas. The old man sat still, his hands resting on his knees, waiting for the verdict. "I have been sitting in this chair for a very long time," Sterling began. His voice was rough, softer than it had been earlier. He cleared his throat, trying to find the professional tone he usually used, but it wouldn't come. He sounded human. He sounded humble. "I have heard thousands of pianists. I have heard children who play faster than anyone I know. I have heard adults who play with machines inside them, perfect and precise. I know every note of that piece you just played. I know how it is supposed to sound on paper." He paused. He looked at the battered piano with the silver tape on the pedal. "But in 30 years, Sterling said, his voice shaking just a little, I have never heard music like that." The room went completely silent again. Everyone hung on his next word. "I told you earlier that this was not a real piano," Sterling said, gesturing to the instrument. "I laughed at it. I laughed at you." He stopped, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "And I am so deeply, deeply sorry for that, because I was wrong. That isn't just a piano. That is a masterpiece of the heart." Thomas's lip trembled. He looked down at his lap, trying to hide the tears that were now welling up in his eyes. Sterling took a step closer. "You didn't play notes, Thomas. You played a life. And that is something we cannot teach in this school. It is something we cannot buy with money. Thank you. Thank you for showing us what real music sounds like." Sterling didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded, a deep, respectful bow of his head, and then began to clap again. The crowd roared back to life, louder than before. The sound was overwhelming. Thomas sat there for a moment, absorbing it. He looked up at the ceiling, blinking rapidly. Then he turned to the piano. He didn't bow to the audience. Instead, he leaned over and patted the side of the battered instrument, right on the spot where the varnish was peeling. It was a gentle pat, the kind you give a friend who has helped you through a hard time. He whispered something to the wood that no one else could hear.
Then, with difficulty, he pushed himself up from the bench. He stood up straight, despite his aching back. He looked out at the hundreds of people standing for him. He didn't feel like an old man in a cheap suit anymore. He felt like a giant. He raised a trembling hand to acknowledge them, offering a smile that was filled with more joy than the hall had ever seen. The applause continued for a long time. It wasn't the kind of clapping that fades away after 10 seconds. It went on and on, washing over the stage like a warm tide. People in the back rows were standing on their chairs to get a better look. The young musicians, the ones who had laughed or whispered earlier, were now clapping the hardest. They realized they had just seen something rare, something they couldn't learn from a textbook. Thomas stood in the center of the spotlight, looking out at the sea of faces. He gave a small, humble bow. It wasn't a fancy, theatrical bow. It was just him bending slightly at the waist, clutching his hands together. When he straightened up, his eyes were shining. He looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind you feel after finishing a hard day's work that you know meant something. He didn't say anything into the microphone. He didn't have a speech prepared. He just nodded once more, a silent thank you to the room, and turned back to his instrument. He reached down and locked the keyboard cover with a soft click. It was a simple sound, but it signaled that the moment was over. Now came the hard part. He had to get the piano off the stage. Earlier, when he was pushing the heavy dolly up the ramp, he had struggled. His back hurt and his breath was short. The stage manager, a young man with a headset and a clipboard, had watched him struggle with a look of annoyance before, checking his watch and sighing. But things were different now. As Thomas gripped the handle of the dolly to wheel it toward the exit ramp, the stage manager didn't check his watch. He didn't sigh. He immediately dropped his clipboard on a chair and ran up the ramp. He didn't ask for permission. He just grabbed the other handle of the dolly. "Let me help you with that, sir," the young man said. His voice was full of respect. Thomas looked at him, surprised. "Oh, I can manage. She's heavy, but I know her ways." "Please," the young man insisted, putting his weight into the push. "I want to help." Together, they steered the battered piano toward the ramp. As they reached the edge of the stage, the tall cello player from the waiting area ran up. He didn't say a word. He just moved to the back of the dolly, putting his hands on the frame to guide it down the slope, making sure it didn't roll too fast. Then the girl with the shiny violin joined in, standing by the side to make sure the wheels didn't catch on the carpet. It was a strange procession, an old man in a faded suit pushing a broken piano, surrounded by young, talented people in expensive clothes, all helping him move it. They moved slowly, carefully, as if they were transporting a chest of gold instead of a pile of wood and wires. Mr. Sterling watched from his seat at the table. He hadn't sat down yet. He looked to the group disappear into the wings, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He looked down at the evaluation sheet in front of him. It was a mess. He had crossed out the negative comments. In the blank space at the bottom, in large, hurried letters, he wrote, "Unprecedented soul, score 100." He looked up at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take a 10-minute intermission. We all need a moment to breathe." The crowd began to filter out into the lobby, buzzing with excitement. They were talking about the performance, replaying the music in their heads, but Sterling just sat there, looking at the empty spotlight on the stage. Backstage, it was chaotic, but a good kind of chaotic. Usually, the hallway was filled with stress. People were rushing to tune instruments, fix their hair, or panic about their song choices. But today, the hallway was quiet. As Thomas wheeled the piano into the corner, the other competitors parted like the Red Sea to let him through. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, walked up to him. She was holding a small bottle of water. She was nervous. "Excuse me," she said in a small voice. "Yes, sweetheart?" You sounded really nice," she said, holding out the water. "I think you should drink this." Thomas took the bottle. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline fading. "Thank you," he said softly. "That is very kind of you." "Was that your piano?" she asked, looking at the duct tape. "It looks like my grandma's furniture." Thomas laughed, a warm, rumbling sound. "It is. It was my wife's piano, actually. We bought it together a long time ago." The girl nodded seriously. "I think she would be happy you played it today." Thomas stopped laughing. He looked at the girl, then at the piano. He reached out and touched the peeling wood again. "Yes," he whispered, "I think she would be." He took a drink of the water. It was cool and refreshing. He felt his strength coming back a little. The young people around him were smiling at him, offering encouraging nods. No one was laughing at the duct tape anymore. They saw it for what it was, a scar, a story, a badge of honor. Thomas walked over to a quiet spot near the exit where he had left his coat. He sat down on a wooden crate, catching his breath before he had to load the piano into his truck outside. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling, but they felt lighter. He realized then that he hadn't played for the judges. He hadn't played to win the prize. He had played to prove that the old piano still had a song in it. And by playing that song, he had proven that he still had a place in this world. He wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a musician. After a few minutes, Mr. Sterling walked through the velvet curtain into the backstage area. The crowd of students quieted down as he tasked. He was holding a piece of paper. He walked straight over to Thomas, who was sitting on the crate. He didn't stand over him. He crouched down so they were eye to eye. It was a position the powerful director almost never took. "Thomas," Sterling said. His voice was kind now, stripped of all the arrogance from before.
"Hello, sir," Thomas said, sitting up a bit straighter. "I hope I didn't go over my time." Sterling shook his head. "Time doesn't matter. Not today." He held out the paper. It was a certificate. "We don't usually give these out until the end of the day, but I wanted you to have this now." Thomas took it. It was a special commendation for outstanding artistic expression. It wasn't the first prize for technical skill, but in many ways it was heavier. It was real. "I don't know what to say," Thomas said, looking at the paper. "You don't have to say anything," Sterling said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card. He wrote a personal number on the back of it. "If you ever want to play that piano somewhere, anywhere, you call me. I don't care if it's a concert hall or a street corner. I want to be there to hear it." Thomas looked at the card, then up at Sterling. For a second, the two men just looked at each other. There was no need for more words. They understood each other completely. The judge who had forgotten what music was, and the player who had never forgotten. "Thank you," Thomas said, putting the card carefully into his breast pocket, right over his heart. Sterling stood up. He patted Thomas on the shoulder, a firm, fatherly pat. "Take care of that piano, Thomas, and take care of yourself." "I will," Thomas promised. Sterling walked away, heading back to the stage to resume the competition. But he walked differently. He walked slower. He looked like a man who had just remembered why he loved music in the first place. Thomas sat on the crate for a few more minutes, listening to the sounds of the tuning instruments and the hushed whispers. He finished his water and crushed the plastic bottle in his hand. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked over to the dolly. The struggle to load the piano into his old truck outside was real. It was heavy. It was awkward. The sun was starting to set, casting long orange shadows across the parking lot. He grunted and groaned, sweat dripping down his face as he lifted the ramp. It wasn't magic. It was just hard work. But as he slammed the tailgate shut, securing the old piano with a rope, he didn't feel tired. He felt alive. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. It coughed and sputtered before turning over. He sat there for a moment, looking at the empty passenger seat. For a second, he imagined her sitting there, humming along to the radio. He smiled. "Did you hear that, Martha?" he asked the empty air. "They liked us." He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. He didn't win the big trophy. He wasn't going to be famous. He was just going home. But as he drove, the old truck felt lighter. The battered piano in the back rattled against the metal walls, making a soft, rhythmic sound. It wasn't a melody, but to Thomas it sounded like a song. It was the sound of dignity. It was the sound of love. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world.